We know a lot about the president while they are in office, but do we always take such a deep look into their lives after they leave the Oval Office? On today's most amazing top 10 list, I'll be covering some of the darkest final moments from presidents throughout history. Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot, we have the 18th President of the United States, Ulysses S. Grant. I am certainly no American political expert, but by what I read about Ulysses Grant, he seemed to be a pretty alright guy. His death came on July 23, 1885, after he lost his battle with throat cancer. His last spoken word was water, which is pretty sad considering what he was going through. But he did lose the ability to speak sometime before his death, so a more accurate portrayal of his last words would be something he wrote shortly before he passed. He wrote, "There was never one more willing to go than I." That is so dark and sad to think that he was just kind of done with life. But after suffering a painful disease, I can understand why. He certainly lived quite the life as he made it all the way to being the president. He was only 63 at the time, but I feel like by 1885 standards, that might have been pretty old. Heading on down to number 9, we have the 20th President of the United States, James Garfield. James had a similar outlook to a lot of people at the time and thought that the assassination of Abraham Lincoln was just a fluke and denied the opportunity to have security guards around him constantly. Unfortunately, on July 2nd, 1881, this decision led to him getting shot twice by a man who was trying to assassinate him. James lived for a few months after, but was struggling pretty hard to survive because of the lack of medical technology available to remove the bullet that was still lodged in him. On the day of his death, James lay down to rest before he awoke, clutching his chest. His friend, General David Swaim, was by his side, and James reached out for him and asked, "Swaim, can't you stop this pain?" These were his final words, and it's so sad to know that he passed in such pain, but I'm glad he had his friend near to him at the time. In our number 8 spot today, we have the 21st President of the United States, Chester Alan Arthur. Before I dive into this one, guys, please don't forget to hit that thumbs up because it really helps us out. Chester was actually the 20th vice president, but became the 21st president after the death of James Garfield. After his presidency was finished, Chester went back to work at his New York law firm. He had some health issues already, so he wasn't working a ton, but on November 16th, 1885, he ordered for all of his personal and official papers to be burned, which seems like kind of weird behavior. The following day, he suffered a cerebral hemorrhage and never regained consciousness until he passed the next day. While Chester's last words weren't officially recorded, a friend of his said that his last words to him were that life is not worth living. This is a pretty dark message to leave someone, but maybe Chester didn't know that this was the last time that he would speak to this friend. In our number 7 spot, we have the 22nd and the 24th President of the United States, Grover Cleveland. Grover has not been regarded as a particularly great president, and it has been said that his greatest accomplishment might have been the introduction that he gave so that the more modern presidency that began with Theodore Roosevelt could emerge. In the fall of 1907, Grover fell very ill, and in 1908, he ended up suffering a heart attack. On June 24th, 1908, he ended up passing away with his last words being, "I have tried so hard to do right." I think this is pretty dark because it's sad to think that he was worried about the impact he had left on the world in his final moments. Death really does seem like the worst time to start having an existential crisis. In our number 6 spot, we have the 23rd President of the United States, Benjamin Harrison. Benjamin was actually the grandson of the 9th president, making them the only grandfather-grandson duo to have both held office. He was a Republican who took office in between the terms of Grover Cleveland and lost out on re-election. He definitely isn't ranked among the top or best presidents, but his commitment and his integrity are not questioned. Benjamin had an interesting personal life, considering after his wife passed, he remarried, but it just so happens that the woman he chose was the 37-year-old niece and former secretary of his late wife. In February of 1901, Benjamin was diagnosed with influenza, which at the time was called grippe. He was treated the best way that they knew how at the time, but on March 13th, at the age of 67, he ended up passing away. What the doctors had thought was influenza was actually pneumonia, which was the cause of his death. His last words were, "Are the doctors here? Doctor, my lungs." It's super sad to know that he was in pain, and I'm not sure if they knew what pneumonia was in 1901, but if they did, it would be such a shame that he was misdiagnosed and mistreated. Pneumonia isn't fun even in 2020 when we have better ways of treating it. In our 5th spot and halfway mark, we have the 32nd President of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Franklin still holds the record for the longest time in office, as he was elected 4 consecutive times. Of course, this was before the 2-term limit that now exists. Franklin is regarded as one of the best presidents there's ever been, but of course there have been plenty of people who criticized his policies and positions, but also because of the fact that he was the president for most of World War II, his response to that was also highly scrutinized. Franklin was able to serve 3 terms entirely and was 2 months and 23 days into his 4th term when he passed. On April 12th of 1945, Franklin was sitting for a portrait when he said, "I have a terrific headache." He then slumped over in his chair, and upon examination by his attending cardiologist, he ended up passing away from an intracerebral hemorrhage. It's crazy to think that he had no idea what he was just seconds away from, and that he really did just think he had a headache. I guess maybe that's a good way to go though. I feel really bad for the guy that was doing the portrait because I feel like that would be very awkward. In our number 4 spot, we have the 34th President of the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Dwight was a 5-star general in the Army during World War II before he became president. Dwight has been seen as an inactive president, but some things that he has been praised for are ending the Korean War and not starting any others in the meantime, and for stabilizing the Soviet-American rivalry. On March 28, 1969, Dwight ended up passing away at the Walter Reed Army Medical Center from congestive heart failure. He was 78 at the time, and his last words ended up being, "I want to go. God take me." I guess it's a good thing that he felt ready when it came time, but it is pretty scary to think that he had just kind of given up. Maybe his time in the war gave him some memories that he just didn't want to have anymore. Coming in at our number 3 spot, we have the 35th President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. The Kennedy family is one of the most politically established families in American history. John is highly regarded as a great president and actually came 3rd in a list of highly admired people of the 20th century. John and his wife were slightly younger than their predecessors, which gave them this sort of pop culture influence as well as their obviously political influence. On Friday, November 22nd, 1963 at 12:30 p.m., John was assassinated as he was traveling in a presidential motorcade throughout downtown Dallas, Texas. He ended up being struck by 2 bullets and was immediately taken to hospital, where he was pronounced dead 30 minutes later. While I don't have time to go into who assassinated him or why, I will tell you that his last words were to a woman named Nellie Connolly, who was traveling in the same car as him. She had said to him, "You certainly can't say that the people of Dallas haven't given you a warm welcome, Mr. President," to which he replied, "No, you certainly can't." It's crazy because they very obviously had no idea about what was just moments away from happening, but I'm glad that it seems like he was feeling welcomed and well loved before this tragic incident took place. Moving on to our number 2 spot, we have the 36th President of the United States, Lyndon B. Johnson. Lyndon was the vice president to John F. Kennedy, but took over the presidency after the assassination we just talked about. When Lyndon first held office, he was looked down upon and had some pretty low ratings. Since then, however, he has began to become regarded as an above-average president, and some of the policies he put in place still exist and remain intact today. Lyndon shocked America when he decided not to run for a second term, but it was because he was worried about his health and being unable to make it all the way through. Lyndon had a bunch of heart problems and suffered 2 heart attacks. Surgery was considered for him, but doctors weren't sure he was healthy enough to be able to survive it. On January 22nd, 1973, Lyndon called for help on his telephone as he was suffering another massive heart attack. His last words were, "Send Mike immediately." Mike was his Secret Service agent who was housed not too far from where Lyndon was, but by the time Mike got there, it was already too late. I hate the idea that he died alone, but he lived a good life and accomplished a lot before his passing, and even if Mike was there, the outcome most likely wouldn't have been any different. In our number 1 spot today, we have the 37th President of the United States, Richard Nixon. Richard has quite the reputation for his second term due to the rise of Watergate, and was the only president who resigned from the position. There is a lot to unpack about Richard's second term, and we'll honestly have to save that for another video, but we will skip to what you're here for. On April 18th, 1994, Richard unfortunately suffered a stroke. He was awake and alert for a while, but unable to speak. Because of the trauma his brain had suffered, he ended up slipping into a coma before he passed away on April 22nd. Before the stroke, his last words were to his housekeeper, and all he said was help. It's really scary to know that he knew something bad was happening to him, but it really is even scarier to have been awake and unable to speak for the rest of the time after that. Luckily, when he did end up passing, he was 81 years old, and he had his daughters by his side so that they could tell him that they loved him and say their goodbyes. Alright guys, that has been our list for today. Thank you so much for checking it out. I've been your host, Olivia Kozlowski, and I'll see you next time.